Hello and welcome to the Exeter City Supporters Trust podcast, Trust Us, We Own a Football Club. This episode is our Black History Month special, featuring an interview by trustee Yasmin Weston, who interviewed Matt Tiller and Greg Foxsmith of the Jack Leslie campaign, and an interview by Ewan Beer, Comms Secretary, who interviewed Martin Weiler, former Trust Chairman and member of One Game One Community. But first, some big Trust news. The elections are coming up. We'll have online voting for the first time in the Trust history, and on the Saturday the 7th of November, we'll have our virtual hustings. You may have also seen on the Trust official social medias and the club's official social medias that the fan cardboard cutouts are back and they're making a return to the ground, this time in the Adam Stansfield stand and the Big Bank. Thank you to all the Trust volunteers who made it possible to see our familiar faces back in the ground. And now for Yas Weston's interview with Matt Tiller and Greg Foxsmith of the Jack Leslie campaign.
So I am here with Matt and Greg from the Jack Leslie campaign. Guys, if you'd like to quickly introduce yourself, a little bit about yourselves and how you got involved, that'd be great.
Hi, Yasmin. Thank you very much for having us. Yeah, I'm Matt Tiller, and I have been an Argyle fan for, I don't know, I probably tell you, give away my age, but a very long time. Grew up in Plymouth, near Greg, who I set the campaign up with. And I learned about the Jack story and the England call-up last year, and immediately kind of it shocked me, I guess, that I didn't know the story before. Started looking into it and talking to other Argyle fans like Greg, and he was so enthused that we just decided that we had to do something when there should be a statue to this amazing player.
Yeah, hi, I'm Greg Foxsmith, long-suffering Argyle fan, and like Matt, I live in London now rather than Plymouth, but we watch Argyle when they play away, and or if we're on trips home, and also a late arrival to the Jack Leslie story. And when Matt told me about Jack Leslie and the story of the England selection, I said, well, let's do a statue. I think we'd had a couple of pints, and on the basis of that rash declaration, launched the campaign. So sometime later, we finally officially launched, and here we are.
So you spoke a little bit there about from humble pub beginnings. Was that kind of where the Jack Leslie campaign started? Was it just a couple of mates in the pub and then things got together as they do?
That's exactly it. We talk about it really as a concept, and began thinking about how we might do it. And we started by setting up a website and a Twitter account. But we didn't realise, of course, at that time that events nationally would make it very good timing to do a statue campaign, because we had launched the campaign and thought of the idea before the current wave of Black Lives Matter protests and before statues were being toppled in Bristol and all the rest of it. So in that sense, it was quite timely.
So was there, I guess, a short build up before things really started to kind of get running in terms of the campaign, or was it like a slow for people to catch on to it?
I think we actually started talking about it seriously towards the end of last year, and started talking to Argyle and Simon Hallett, who we were delighted to hear that they were really keen to celebrate Jack as a key player in Argyle's history, and were planning to name the boardroom in the new Mayflower grandstand after Jack. So we kind of agreed to kind of hang on until this year, and spent our time kind of, I guess, preparing the ground. But what was great is knowing that the club was on board with this. And we started making plans, and then the pandemic hit, and we were all set to launch in April with a family visit from all the Jack Leslie family, some of whom actually live in Exeter. I'm not sure if they're Exeter fans, but they do. And they've been great. The wider family, really supportive. And they were planning to visit Argyle in April, and that was I think the first match that was called off, in fact. And so we put everything on hold, thinking we'll just, we've got our website up, we're telling people about it, we're making contacts, we're making plans. We thought we could wait until football sort of returned to some kind of normality, and then, events, across the pond, and then in Bristol, and then people were spotting our website and the campaign and mentioning us in the press, and suddenly the BBC said, we want to put you on the national news. And Greg and I got together and said, well, we better launch, and we're very glad now that we did.
We always, although we had the club's blessing, we always remained independent of Argyle. We are, the Jack Leslie campaign isn't a Plymouth Argyle campaign, even though he was a Plymouth Argyle player. And we always thought and hoped that the story would resonate, beyond the Argyle family and appeal to football fans across the country. And obviously the national coverage helped with that. And we've been amazed at how widespread the support for the Jack Leslie statue is. It's not just an Argyle thing, it's a football thing, part of the football family, really.
Yeah, and I think that definitely shows with the combined donation to the Jack Leslie campaign from the Devon Supporters Trust group, which I suppose is kind of the first thing the group has done. And obviously for us as Exeter City Supporters Trust trustees, it was something that we were more than happy to get involved with. But definitely, obviously, with the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter campaign, was that something you ever thought of in terms of, obviously you two as like white males, was that something you ever thought of might be a sticking issue in representing a Black Lives Matter as white people? Like, was there considerations there to kind of reach out to a black audience as well?
I think we always want. Obviously, we're from Devon. We grew up in Plymouth, not a particularly diverse city, but we always wanted to reach out to all communities. I think it's important that everyone embraces, Jack's story, but also supports that movement. I think we're very sort of clear about that there is that's part of our aims and objectives is to celebrate diversity and combat racism, and Greg and I are very passionate about that, and we're delighted that members of Jack Leslie's family, but also football stars of yesteryear, both nationally and locally, from Viv Anderson and Brendan Batson to Ronnie Mojay, who has been amazing, kind of talking about how, knowing, if he'd known Jack's story when he came to Argyle in the 90s, that would have been empowering for him. And what a shame that he didn't know that at that time. And I think Greg and I feel the same, that the white audience, the white fans in Plymouth, the majority are, how great would that have been for us as children to have learned that story?
I think we have been sensitive to the fact that we are two, white guys, and it's a campaign to celebrate and tell the story of a black footballer who suffered an injustice. But I'm unashamed about that. At the end of the day, as the Black Lives Matter, one of their campaign slogans is "Silence is violence." So when you learn of an injustice to a black footballer, as a white fan, you can either stay silent and hope that someone will pick it up, or you can do something about it. And I've been happy to be a part of a positive campaign on that. And of course, we have made sure that the campaign is as diverse as possible and welcome support from all sections of the community. We have a very diverse campaign. So even though it's launched by two white guys, our support base covers, I think, a very wide range from the black community and as I said, the football community, but also people who aren't interested in football, but just have been really moved by the story.
Yeah, I definitely think, given obviously everything that's gone on in football at the moment with the Black Lives Matter movement, having some elements of allyship that aren't, what can generally be seen as performative in terms of taking the knee and things like that, but actually seeing clubs doing some, like realistic ways of showing their support to the black community, such as, attributing the new boardroom to Jack Leslie and also this statue. So tell us a little bit more about the statue. Where's it going to be? That kind of thing. You're looking for the artist at the moment.
Yes, we prioritised really the fundraising first, because it would have been crazy to start commissioning sculptors and not know if we could raise the money. So having now hit a target that will deliver a statue, we can start the commissioning process, and we're going to put out invitations to sculptors to send in their ideas. At the same time, we haven't quite stopped fundraising, because although we know we can deliver a statue, and that's really good news, more money means a bigger and better statue, and perhaps a wider range of people who can contribute towards those ideas, as well as deliver our education. So I hope at the end of the podcast you'll remind me to tell you the website address so that people can still contribute to that. But we are starting the process of reaching out to sculptors, and that of course will be part of the fun bit. But obviously we need, it's not just going to be down to Matt and myself. Matt, perhaps you can explain the family and other people we're contacting.
Yeah, I mean, Greg and I talked about the process and how we should do this. We've had many sculptors get in touch, and some have put in their sort of physical pictures, such as, there's a maquette in the background of Greg's picture. We've had a couple of maquettes, which are sort of mini statues in either resin or bronze, that have come forward, and we've had lots of approaches, but we want to spread the net as wide as possible. And for us, sort of most crucially, we'll obviously let those that are shortlisted we'll let those names out to the public, and our major supporters. But most crucially, alongside the club and the local council, who have to give us planning permission, it's the family. It's all about the family for us, and particularly the three granddaughters, Jill, Leslie, and Lynn, who have just been phenomenal throughout this process. We want them to be happy with the final result. So it will be open. We'll be showing people those designs that come in that are shortlisted, but really it's going to be, let's choose the best design that they are happy with. So that's our process. It will start kind of officially at the beginning of November, and we'll be calling out for pitches, and we also want sculptors to tell us why they want to engage in it, because they've got to be passionate about this this project.
So I suppose, jumping back a little bit, how was it that you found out about Jack's story? Is he someone at Plymouth Argyle that I suppose is already well revered, or was it something that took a little bit of digging?
There was a mural to Jack Leslie in one section of the stand, although not the area that I tend to go in. I hadn't seen it, and he certainly appears, in the stats, because, as you'd imagine, with 137 goals and 400 appearances, he's in the record books. But you wouldn't necessarily even know that he was black just looking at his name and the record. And certainly there was nothing really about the England story that was familiar to contemporary fans, which is why Matt and I, only came across it ourselves last year. So I found out about it from Matt, and he himself learned it by word of mouth. Is that right, Matt?
Yeah, I was in a bar at a party, and it was my wife's friend's dad, Tony, who's an Argyle fan. So obviously, naturally, I'm sure it's the same for Exeter fans. If you end up in a place and there's another fan of your Devon club, you're going to start talking. And Tony started enthusing about this story, and I was amazed by the story. I kind of, part of me thinking, is this really happen? And then as soon as I got home, started looking into it, and doing some research online and finding out the information, going, this actually is true. And then felt like more articles kind of came out last year, some sort of academic pieces and stuff in the press, I guess at the same time as the boardroom as well. And then I started digging back into the archives, and it was all there. And so it was from a conversation in a pub with another fan, and there were, I think, I guess when I was a young lad, you don't really look deep into your club's history. You're so focused on the present, I think. And unless the club itself celebrates it, you just don't go there. There's the odd moment. We all remember, Pele playing, even though I was thankfully too young even to have seen that. But they didn't sort of go that far back, and which is strange, because it was one of the most successful, if not the most successful, Argyle teams, in fact, wasn't it, Greg?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so certainly the team exploits are well known, as indeed was Jack Leslie's striking partner, Sammy Black. Now, that's a name that was probably more familiar to Argyle fans. And Sammy Black was a phenomenal player, and in some ways his stats at a club level and longevity, are comparable or outshine Jack Leslie's. But the whole England selection story, is such a significant part of that.
In Jack's defence, Greg, he was injured. It was a lace from a ball that caused an eye injury that put a premature end to his career. So perhaps he would have, the pair of them would have continued. So yeah, but yes, they were obviously a phenomenal partnership. I've managed to speak to, this is one of the great things of the campaign, is talking to people who had memories. I spoke to a 95-year-old fan who saw Jack play and said whenever Jack or Sammy Black got the ball, there was a real kind of feeling, a rustle in the crowd that something was going to happen, there was going to be a goal. So that's really lovely to hear that there was that, they were such a phenomenal partnership. And also they were nationally famous at the time. They really were. They were mentioned in the press many times.
I suppose that's the thing with football club history, isn't it? It's almost like folklore in a sense that unless you have campaigns such as yourselves that really highlight significant players or significant things that have happened, such as at Exeter City, we have the Exeter City Museum, you don't really hear things unless it's fans, through word of mouth that tell you that these things have happened.
Yeah, that's right. And certainly, I suppose the information at club level, as I say, was there for fans who were interested in the history. But the England story, was surprisingly unknown. In the book Pitch Black, which is a sort of history of black football in Britain, there's no mention of Jack Leslie. The author knows the story now and is, and the family and is on board. And as we heard, people like Viv Anderson didn't know the story, although he does now and supports the campaign and has been incredibly supportive. But that's, I think, why we've been proud to almost, put some light onto something that happened 100 years ago, in the hope that we're not just about saying that happened and it was wrong, but I hope saying that we are different and we are better now. And we hope the story will resonate, for example, in schools. Here we are in Black History Month, and we're taking the story out into primary schools, and it's a really good topic because young people, and particularly boys, can understand at a very simple level what it's like to have a talent but then not be picked, even in the school playground. You can imagine what it'd be like not to be picked because of a physical characteristic, skin color or something of that type. So we found that the story really does resonate, and I'm delighted that what was being hidden for so long has not only come out but in a really positive way.
I think it says a lot about Black history generally, that there's obviously a huge focus on it now, that the stories were always there. And, actually Jack's story, when you look, had been reported at various times. At the time of Viv Anderson's selection, in the early 2000s, there was a report on local TV. So that these things, they were there. It just they just didn't cut through. I think people just went, "Oh, okay, fine, we'll move on." And I think things have changed. That there are obviously still massive issues there. I mean, in football and society, which is why I think we need to, take stories like Jack's and use them as educational tools, because and the statue will be a part of that, because you just look at what's happened to players like Ian Wright. You just look on social media, it's insane. It's still there. It's and it has to start with education.
I think that's something we can all do as white allies in Black History Month, but also every month is through, the reason why we're sitting down and doing this podcast is, to take those stories that may, for whatever reason, not be so amplified, and obviously amplify them to the level that they deserve to be at. And obviously it's a very proud piece of local history for Devon, as you said, traditionally a place that isn't very diverse, to have had the first Black football player called up for England is a proud thing for our county, not just for Plymouth Argyle, but for every football fan in Devon.
That's absolutely true. And there's also interesting that at the time, when Jack Leslie came to Plymouth 1921, he would have been certainly stood out, as you said, lack of diversity, in Devon. But he was clearly warmly welcomed and very popular figure, both with the fans and with professional colleagues. He became club captain, and we think is probably the first Black footballer to have captained a professional football team. So was clearly held in high regard. And then wind forward to some of the sort of overt and hostile racism that we saw on the football terraces in the 70s and 80s, when black players received, violent abuse from crowds. That situation was a lot worse. So Jack suffered a sort of discrimination, I suppose, at England selection level, but didn't suffer, so far as we can see, no overt racism at Home Park. Whereas later on, to our shame, we know that type of racism on the terraces, which was prevalent, was occurred at Exeter and Plymouth, as it did in football stadiums across the country. So, and Matt's also right to acknowledge that whilst that has gone, we don't have that problem when you go to a live football match. Some of those issues have moved into other spheres with the online abuse and trolling that Ian Wright and Sterling and Rashford and all the others can still experience.
And it's even those like microaggressions we talk about in terms of certain chants alluding to certain stereotypes, and the way in which the press will spin things towards certain players of a certain race as opposed to others, that we can still see today that might not be exactly that overt racism that we saw in Jack's case or in the 70s, but it still is rearing its head in another way.
Yeah, it's really interesting to go back into the archives as well and see the way that that Jack was referred to, and not surprisingly, the language is language that we wouldn't use now, and there was a sort of certain element of sort of individual abuse, but I suppose when he was sort of playing away, not surprisingly, I think, but I guess him being the only black player for many years, certainly between 1921 and 29. It must have been quite odd, and he the way he kind of described it was almost like it was what would happen to any player. Any sort of characteristic was picked on. So whereas in the 70s and 80s, when more black players were coming through, it was kind of a barrage. It's difficult to know what he went through. You can only listen to what he said, but it would have been very different. But at the same time, he would have been very isolated as the only black player.
So since launching the campaign, you have exceeded your initial target of £100,000. So you currently have £136,000 donated from nearly 2,000 supporters, which is absolutely fantastic. Obviously, the Devon Supporters Trust being one of them. So obviously the main part of your campaign is the building of the statue, but there are other things that you want to do with raising the profile of Jack's story. You mentioned going into primary schools and teaching the local community about Jack's story as well.
Yeah, thank you. We'd like to put on record our thanks to the Devon Supporters Trusts for pitching in, and we've had individual donations from fans of Exeter, Torquay, clubs across the country, and no fans, and it's still welcome. We're still fundraising, because as well as building, we hope, a bigger and better statue, we want money so that we can take the project into schools. So for education, whether it's Black History Month or beyond, we're doing partnership work with different bodies to roll out a really good platform to tell the story and make sure that it resonates in a positive way to challenge prejudice and discrimination, and just, really turn what was a sadness, I suppose, of 100 years ago into a positive factor for the future.
The great thing about Jack's story is that we have this injustice that he suffered, and it's important to highlight that. But he got on with his footballing career, made a huge success of himself, took Argyle to promotion and to with his team to, I think, their highest league position, fourth in the second division, and went on to captain the side, as we said, and was really well loved in Plymouth. And it's great to hear. We just had an email today from one of Jack's granddaughters saying how pleased Jack would have been to know that his story was being used in this way, and that's wonderful to hear. That's really important to us. So yeah, we hope it continues to do positive work.
Brilliant. So if people do want to find the Jack Leslie campaign to either find out some more information, or if they have been inspired to donate, how can they go about finding you guys?
Well, you can get more information or donate through the website www.jackleslie.co.uk.
Brilliant. Any social media handles?
Yeah, and follow us on Twitter, please, at Jack Leslie Camp, and also on Facebook and Instagram.
Yep, the Jack Leslie campaign.
Brilliant.
A massive thank you to Yaz, Greg and Matt for taking the time to talk to us about the Jack Leslie campaign. We also briefly got a chance to speak to Robin Causley, Vice Chairman of the Torquay United Supporters Trust, and Tony Cannon, Vice Chairman of Argyle Fans Trust. Here's Robin Causley of the Torquay United Supporters Trust.
Torquay United Supporters Trust is delighted to support this campaign along with our colleagues at Plymouth and Exeter. I think it's a very, very worthwhile campaign, one that has resonated with our fans and fans right across the country and the world indeed. So I'm not surprised that it's raised so much money. I think it's a staggering amount of money that has been raised. I think over 2,000 supporters, but it's a very important campaign. To think that somebody was denied an England shirt based on the colour of the skin all those years ago, it is something which is quite shameful, and something that needs to be remembered to this day and marked by this fitting tribute outside the ground. But I think it's also important to note that Jack overcame that awful setback and became a very fine player, captain of Plymouth Argyle, and made a high number of appearances for the club. And he was highly respected at West Ham as well, where he worked in the background. So a truly remarkable person, a very important person in the social histories of the city, and indeed in black history and the history of football. This will be a fitting tribute. And also be an educational one, something that people can talk about the experiences of black people then, and then link it to the issues that are still around today, as Black Lives Matters has highlighted for footballers and society in general, as a BME person. So it's something we're very pleased to back, and we very much look forward to the unveiling of the statue when it finally happens in a number of months' time.
And now, Tony Cannon of the Argyle Fans Trust.
Tony Cannon, I'm the Vice Chair of the Argyle Fans Trust. And for me personally, being on the board, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've not been as involved as some of the other board members have, but obviously I've been around during the meetings when decisions have been made. And whilst we have obviously our local rivalries and such things with Devon, with Torquay and Exeter, we're all Devon and we all come together, and it's nice to see such a joint effort on behalf of the Jack Leslie campaign, and it will be such a proud moment when we see that statue going up.
Thank you very much to Robin and Tony for taking the time to talk to us. And here's Julian Beer with his interview with Martin Weiler, former Trust Chairman and member of One Game One Community.
Hello guys, I'm Julian Beer and I'm joined today by former Trust Chairman Martin Weiler. Hello Martin.
Hi Julian, thanks very much for having me on.
Well, it's a privilege to have you on, Martin. Thank you very much for taking the time out to join us. For those who don't know that much about Martin, obviously former Trust Chairman, but very importantly, he's been involved with the One Game One community, and he's also would you say, active member of the history group, Martin?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm a secretary of the history group and a trustee of the Exeter City Football Club Museum.
Excellent stuff. We're going to start a bit with the One Game One community. You were obviously there when it started in 1997. Can you talk to us a little bit about what One Game One community does with Exeter City, how it's linked with Kick It Out, and sort of how the story has progressed from its inception to modern day?
I think it's really hard in 2020 to think back to the 1970s and 1980s and a lot of the racism that existed around football, but that kind of culminated with increasing numbers of people saying we've got to do something about this. And nationally, Kick It Out was set up as an anti-racism in football organisation in 1996. And we'd had our own problems here in Exeter, things like the National Front leafleting crowds, racist incidents on the terraces. And we felt we ought to be playing our part locally in promoting the message of Kick It Out. So we set up a Kick It Out group in 1997. That was when we started it, led by inspirational Fran Jenkin, who many people will know, Lawrence Overand, who was my predecessor as chair of the trust, and Fran was Lawrence's mum. Big supporter and very, very strong on creating a diverse and equal atmosphere at Exeter City. So we set up a group in 1997, and it was just an informal group gathering people around to see what we could do. And what was very exciting was that, and I think this says something, was that the commitment from the top of the football side. So I can still remember sitting round Fran's kitchen table with Peter Fox, who was the manager of the club, and Noel Blake, the assistant manager, player manager. And they were absolutely part of setting up Kick It Out right from the start. And we worked with local black and minority ethnic representatives, people like Anderson Jones, who was involved very much through our early years, people like the local police, linking up with places like the university, and just generally getting a group of people around that could work on various projects to kind of promote the equality message. And it was very much based around racism at that time. And one of the first things we decided to do was to hold a Kick It Out day at the club. And in November 1997, we played Peterborough at home, and that was our first Kick It Out day. And Peter Fox got amazingly involved in the detail. He wanted to choreograph the whole thing, the way the players walked out, how they stood, where the banners would be. It was amazing to have a manager of the football club kind of taking that much interest in what we did. And it was incredibly successful. There was a big crowd that day, over 6,000. And we hit a lot of headlines because that was certainly a very new thing to do at Exeter. We take it for granted now when we have our one game, one community days. But back then, that was a big thing to do, to fly the flag of anti-racism and get all the players lined up to make a statement. And I was really interested. I went to the 1999 League Cup final at Wembley. And before the game, I was just looking through the programme, and suddenly I opened it up and there was a massive picture of the players lining up at Exeter City. So it was really nice that we got national recognition for what we were doing as well as local. And one of the things we did in the following years, Kevin Keegan was the manager of England at the time, and we asked him to provide a message for us. And he sent us, we published in a little leaflet, and you got Noel Blake talking about it there, but Kevin Keegan said, I believe we should all kick racism out of football. Exeter City are doing a great job and everyone should get behind them. Football's all about teamwork. Together we can succeed. So there you have the England manager praising the work at Exeter City. And I think that was very important for us in building the confidence of everyone at the club, that we could do this work and build the reputation of the club around what we were doing.
Really, really interesting. I hadn't realised quite how Exeter City's one game, one community group is one of the very first ones to spawn in England and the UK in general.
Well, given that Kick It Out was only formed in 1996 and we set up the following year, I suspect we were one of the very first groups that were formed at clubs. There were others. There was some tremendous work done at other clubs. But we were definitely one of the first. And we started developing all sorts of things to do. And one of the most exciting periods, certainly for me, was when Noel Blake became the manager. He agreed to go and speak to local youth clubs. And quite often I'd go and pick him up. He'd had a hard day on the training ground and everything. He was often hungry. But he'd get in the car, and he said, where are we going? And we'd go off to a youth club, and he was just inspirational. And the kids loved him, and he talked very, very passionately about the racism that he'd experienced. I mean, he played for Leeds. So you can kind of imagine the sort of atmosphere he had to face very often, played for Portsmouth as well. But to go and talk to youngsters right across Exeter time and time again, I think that was a really brilliant bit of ambassadorial work by Noel, and I know the kids it really made an impression on them, and he was delighted to do it, and he really led from the front in terms of supporting the work that we did.
Interesting how some of these things just don't necessarily aren't remembered or aren't sort of passed on to fans my age or even younger potentially, about how much good work has been done beforehand already in somewhere where you might not expect it, in somewhere like Exeter City.
Another thing we did in the I think 2005 was the first time we did it, and this was very much promoted by Anderson Jones, who was a local black footballer, who said that not enough people from the black and minority ethnic communities are coming together and having football opportunities. So we actually promoted a tournament which was held at the university to kind of give opportunities for various teams from the local black and minority ethnic communities to come and play. And it was incredibly successful straight away. And that tournament is still taking place every summer to this day. And players will come along from the club officials, often involved with somebody like the mayor will come and open it. One of the top officials from the university will come along and speak. And wonderfully, it has been supported, by our. One of the things we developed was having one of the players as our ambassadors. So a whole series of players have been our ambassadors, and I think one of the most exciting things now, looking back, and it's interesting the point you make about history, that you forget certain things. I mean, at the moment, obviously, the story of Ollie Watkins is quite an extraordinary one, and we're all very proud at Exeter City. But one of the things that I saw up close was Ollie, for 2 years, was our One Game One Community ambassador, and he was just so good in the role. So he would come each year to the launch of the football tournament at the university, and obviously all the players would like to see a real footballer, professional footballer. But he was just spent time talking to all the officials and to players. And if you look back, I've got the programme here. Here's Ollie in his Kick It Out t-shirt, promoting one of the Kick It Out games. And I think it's one of those things that we should remember. Not only was Ollie a brilliant footballer, but he was a brilliant young man. And I can remember when the club, we've always worked very closely with the club's charity, the City Community Trust. And one of the things that they opened the doors for was conversations with the local mosque, which is just round the corner from the football ground. And the mosque invited club representatives to go and spend some time, have a meal with them and talk about it. And Ollie came along as our ambassador, and he talked later about what a humbling experience it was. And he was a very young lad at the time, but he really got stuck into the role, as many other players have done over the years.
Do you think that the fact that these players become One Game One Community ambassadors as something that sort of was the foundation for it was laid in the previous years, so obviously starting in 1997, do you think that's what's helped these players then come through and actually get so involved in what you do with One Game One Community?
Absolutely. So I think if you were a young player coming up through the academy, you'd see one of the senior players being the Kick It Out ambassador. I ought to explain, because we interchange a lot, Kick It Out and One Game One Community. For a few years, One Game One Community was the slogan that Kick It Out used. And so we called our group in Exeter after a while. It started off as the Kick It Out group, but we thought One Game One Community, that's a good brand, that's a good slogan. So we changed the name of our group to One Game One Community. And then later, Kick It Out dropped that as their slogan, but we decided to keep it as the name of our Kick It Out group. So that's why the two names are interchangeable. But youngsters would see the senior players being the ambassador for it. They would understand that's part of what goes with being a professional player, that you're asked to do various roles. And we've had a whole range of ambassadors who've been wonderfully supportive from, I don't know, I can remember John O'Flynn, for example, and Arthur Krysiak in more recent years. So we've had a whole range of people who carried out that role. I think Ollie Watkins is one of the few that did it for a couple of years, which just shows what a guy he is.
Certainly does. So obviously with this being Black History Month, a special edition of the podcast, last year for Black History Month, the month was sort of dedicated to, or sort of celebrated, Steve Stacey, who for those that don't know, the first ever black footballer to play for Exeter City, and you yourself have a good relationship with Steve. Can you talk us a bit about what that was like last year, and the whole sort of how that came about?
Well, Steve is a really, really interesting guy. He was born in Bristol during the Second World War, and his dad was a black American serviceman, and his mum was a white local British girl. And it was interesting that Steve later tested his DNA and traced his roots to Guinea-Bissau in Africa. And quite clearly the link was a slave link with America. And so, you know, a descendant of one of the slaves that went to America played football for Exeter City. So it's an amazing story, and he talks a lot about it. He was over here to publish his book, The Colour of Football, which copies are available in the club shop. Brilliant read. So his story is an amazing one. But after he played for Exeter City, he emigrated to Australia, and he now lives in Australia. But a few years ago, I tracked down his email address and just sent him a message saying if he could say a few words to those of us working on the One Game One Community campaign at Exeter. And he sent back the most lovely note. And it turned out that he'd spent a lot of his life post-football working on equality and diversity in sport for Aborigines in Australia. So he absolutely understood the territory of equality and diversity. And we corresponded. I interviewed him and did an article for the programme on the interview. And I pretty much thought that was that, because obviously he was rather a long way away in kind of Perth, Australia. But suddenly it emerged last year that he kept talking to me all the time about, I'm going to write a book. And then he'd start saying things like, I've written the book, I've just got to find a publisher. And in the end, he did find a publisher in Bristol Books. And they invited him over to launch the book last year. And I went to Ashton Gate for the launch event. And we'd asked Steve if he'd come to Exeter and do some events in Exeter. So he came to Exeter last year. He did a Respect Festival event in St Stephen's Church in Exeter, and you can see that interview. I interview him. It's on YouTube. So I just put Steve Stacey Exeter interview. It should come up. And then he came and did a wonderful session in the evening at the club, kind of promoted by the Supporters Trust, the One Game One Community group, the History group, and the Senior Reds. And we just chatted away, and loads of people who came along who'd seen him play for City. So he played for City for 2 seasons, 71 to 73. He was the first African American to play in the Football League, and he was Exeter City's first black player. So he's an important person in the history or the black history of Exeter City. And the next day he was, along with his wife Dot, he was the guest of honour of the board at our match with Forest Green Rovers. So it was really nice that he could come back to Exeter, and we could pay our respects to him, but he could also share his amazing story and inspiring story about really, against all the odds, having a fantastic career in sport, in football. And he played in the old, what would now be the Premier League. He played in the old First Division for Ipswich, very good player, and has done amazing things in his life for Aborigines in Australia as well. So a really interesting guy, and I think here at Exeter City we should be very proud of our relationship with him.
Oh yeah, definitely. It is a very interesting story. A bit, you spoke then a little bit about, you know, the history group mixing a bit with One Game One Community. Obviously you're very involved in both of them, and it's not just Exeter City or the history of Exeter City that you cover. I was talking to Will Barrett, the Exeter City historian, program editor, many roles at Exeter City, but he was telling me a bit about the story of Walter Tull, and sort of the fact that the campaign that was run around Walter Tull sort of earned the museum, is it a medal or a medal, isn't it? Who tells a bit about, well, who Walter Tull is and sort of how the Grecian Archive got involved with that story, which is a fascinating story.
I mean, the story of Walter Tull is absolutely incredible, and I think the more people that know about it, the better. And he and his brother were orphaned at a very young age in London, but he was a very talented footballer. He was picked up by Spurs and played for Spurs in his early career. Sadly, he as one of the very, very rare black footballers at the time, he did suffer a lot of racism, and there's a newspaper report of him playing for Spurs at Bristol City, and the newspaper reporter is ashamed by the things that were being shouted by the crowd, and I think he found it very difficult to play at his best with that kind of obscene abuse. But so he left Tottenham and was transferred to Northampton. Northampton were in the Southern League at the time, in the same division as Exeter. And so quite regularly, Walter Tull would play against Exeter. He actually played 7 times against Exeter, 3 of them at St James's Park. So he made his first debut in front of, I think, something like 5,000 fans at St James's Park for Northampton. And that would have been quite a sight for the Exeter crowd. It would be pretty rare to see a black person at all, but to see one playing football, professional football, I think would have been very interesting. But he became a regular footballer in the Southern League and was a very well-known figure. And I think it's quite interesting. So his last game at St James's Park was in 1914. And Exeter, of course, had just come back from Argentina and Brazil. And Tull went to Argentina with Spurs in 1909. And I always wonder whether some of them might have talked to each other. Oh, how did you find Argentina? And because they had something in common, an extraordinary thing that these working class lads, whether it was Tull or the Exeter lads, you know, had actually been in South America in those early days. So, but of course, World War I comes along. Tull, like so many footballers, enlisted, was a very popular member of the British Army, a very brave person. He actually got injured, but then went back to the front. And interestingly, and it almost defies belief in today's world, that at the time, the law stated that no black person could be an officer of the British Army. But Tull was so widely, highly regarded that they actually did make him an officer, and he was the first British officer black British officer in the army. But sadly, just before the end of the First World War, he was killed on the Somme, very bravely, trying to defend his colleagues, and there's some incredibly moving accounts of his death. I mean, he was quite a remarkable human being, and it's interesting. His brother became the first black dentist in Britain. They were quite a family, and we certainly felt it was a brilliant story. But it was a story that had some Exeter City connections. He played at St James's Park. So we felt we should use that story to kind of make people think about racism and think about the good and the bad in humanity almost. And so we did a little exhibition. You can see it online on the Grecian archive. And we got a couple of awards for doing that, a Walter Toll medal, and we also got a certificate for the work that we did. So I think that was a nice way of history and diversity coming together, because I think there is a long history to a lot of these things that people don't necessarily either know or haven't been told. So there's a lot of hidden stories. The Steve Stacey story, the Walter Toll story, even the Ollie Watkins stories. They're all there, and they're part of a tapestry of Exeter City addressing a big issue like racism.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it should, or it does come as a surprise to me, but it spans literally the entire history of football, really. If you go back all the way to your Walter Tolls, your Jack Leslie's, and then you all the way through to Steve Stacey, Ollie Watkins, etc. It's a constant throughout.
Well, if you look at if you go right back to the beginning, it's always been interesting. We've had a lot of overseas players playing for City over the years, but our first overseas player, amazingly, was a vicar at St James's Church next door, and he was a striker, and he played for Swindon previously, and then the church moved him down here. But he was born in Canada, in Newfoundland. So our first main goal scorer was not only a vicar, but he was an overseas player. So there's so many different stories that show that, our history isn't just a single silo. It's not just predictable. That it shows it is very diverse.
And following on from that, sort of, how important is it for, I'd say Exeter City, but for football in general, to sort of promote a campaign like Black History Month?
I think it's really, really important. I think football I do think football's come a long way. I think we've come a long way at Exeter City, but clearly there's still some things that just don't make sense. Occasionally, sadly, still you get some of the kind of historic incidents of abuse from the terraces and things like that. But I think there are more interesting structural issues. I mean, a high percentage of professional footballers are black. Why are there so few black coaches, black managers, black heads of academy? There is something structural there that leaves you very uncomfortable. So I think there are questions football still has to face, and that's why it's good that we continue to campaign around these issues. And something like Black History Month is a really useful tool to do that. And I think one of the interesting things for me is that although Kick It Out started as a anti-racism organisation, it then developed over the years to cover all the various strands of equality and diversity. So we'll look at issues like disability and promoting facilities, etc., for disabled people in football. And I think we're very, very lucky to have such an active disabled supporters group at Exeter, so ably led by Nick Saunders. I think that's really noticeable around the ground on match day. The work that we've done, the whole issue of sexism and women in football. Again, I think Exeter City's done an awful lot in recent years to address that, and we've obviously been part of promoting that message. We've had a couple of things like Women and Girls Football Days around a first team fixture. I've seen the development of the women's side at Exeter City. Then other issues. One of the biggest ones I think where we've got a really good record is around homophobia in football, and I think we talk about still problems around racism. I think you've got to say there is still an issue in football if no professional footballer currently playing certainly at the football league level, has come out, where statistically clearly there are gay footballers playing in the football league. Now, why don't they want to come out? And so there must be issues around that are causing them some reticence. And so I think the whole campaign of Football v Homophobia, and we're incredibly lucky at Exeter to have the support of Alan Quick, who is leading LGBT campaigner in Exeter Pride, and going back to the heritage thing, has got an amazing collection of Justin Fashanu memorabilia, the one footballer who did come out while he was playing football, and Alan's got an amazing collection of his memorabilia. And when lockdown happened, that was actually the exhibition in the museum. So it's still there, but of course people can't see it at the moment. But campaigning against homophobia is another thing that we've done a lot, and we have an annual game, football v homophobia game at Exeter City, and I think we've really flown the flag there. And again, we got an award, presented with an award by the Football v Homophobia campaign nationally for the work we've done here at Exeter. So now we've gone on a journey that started out really just looking at racism, and now looks at a whole range of issues around the equality and diversity agenda.
No, yeah, the great work that One Game One Community does, certainly the reputation precedes not just the group, but Alan Quick in particular. From my time at Kick It Out, his name was mentioned a few times in the office, and how good he is.
No, we're very, very lucky. You know, we've now got an Exeter Gay Supporters group. We've got a team playing under the City Community Trust umbrella. So, you know, all sorts of things are happening, and Alan's very much been a driving force behind that. And Exeter City have really benefited. And I can remember the first time we said we'd have a Football v Homophobia game. I've got to say, the club were very nervous. They weren't unsupportive, but they were nervous. And I always remember that there was a couple of gay football teams were presented to the crowd before the game, and the amount of applause from the stands really surprised a lot of people, and it gave. I think that was a pivotal moment in our work against homophobia. That times have clearly moved on, and something that probably just couldn't have happened decades before now could happen, and people could start discussing, you know, an issue like that openly. And I think that gave people around the football club a lot of confidence. And again, we've done something similar every year since.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Before I wrap it up, Martin, how would one of our members or a fan of the club, or anyone in the community for that matter, look to get involved with One Game One Community?
Well, I'm sure the group will be absolutely delighted to have people. We're a very informal group. It comes under the Supporters Trust, so it's part of the community side of the Supporters Trust. But you know, the meetings are open to anyone who's interested. So just make contact via the trust. And the group's currently led by Simon Kitchen, and he'd be delighted to hear from anyone who'd like to get involved in our work. You know, the meetings are very interesting. You know, a wide range of people with an interest in all aspects of the work come along, and we have various projects and campaigns, and you know, so it's very much a doing group, which, you know, obviously the more the merrier in terms of the people contributing.
Martin, thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. You were brilliant as always, and as expected. Thank you ever so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you once again to Martin for taking the time to talk to us about Black History Month so passionately. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the first ever episode of the podcast. If you'd like any more information, please follow us both on Facebook and Twitter @WeOwnAPod.